opening of my traveling photovoice exhibition, Violent Infrastructure, Ecologies of Decay and Displacement. The exhibit includes photos taken by internally displaced persons, IDPs, in the Republic of Georgia. The photos were collected as part of a larger feminist visual ethnography that studies protracted displacement under abject infrastructure conditions. In addition to the photo exhibition, you will see many of these photos included in the slideshow. Photo credits are provided on each slide, and all titles and pseudonyms that appear were chosen by the research participants themselves. Thank you so much for this invitation to share this with you tonight. Hosting this is due to the generous support of the Institute for Policy and Governance, the Center for European Union Transatlantic and Trans-European Space Studies, the Center for Refugee, Migrant, and Displacement Studies, and the Community Change Collaborative. Special thanks go to Max, to Scott, who helped to set up the photos, Giannis, Katie, Billy, Brad, everyone who has made my time here so special. I also want to thank the American Research Institute of the South Caucasus, who 2 grants enabled me to do this project, and for Moravian University and their work in helping me develop the initial exhibition that has turned into this traveling photo voice project. So the project that I will discuss tonight is based on my collaboration with 3 dynamic and talented Georgian scholars. I'd like to introduce them even though they're not physically present. The first is Dr. Nino Dzodzonidze, a research analyst at the California Center for Rural Policy at Cal Poly Humboldt. Miriam Orjanakidze, who is the Senior International Relations Officer at Ilia State University, and she just started a master's program in sociology and social anthropology at Central European University. And then Natia Kekanadze, a PhD student in urban studies at Tbilisi State University, and who is also an invited lecturer at the International Black Sea University. So at the end of 2022, UNHCR reports basically 108.4 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. The International Organization of Migration defines forced migration as a migratory movement which, although the drivers can be diverse, involves force, compulsion, or coercion. 62.5 million of these forcibly displaced persons are characterized as internally displaced persons, or IDPs. Unlike refugees, IDPs are on the run at home. In the South Caucasus region, over 1 million people live in protracted and precarious displacement situations. The Nagorno-Karabakh, Abkhazian, and South Ossetian conflicts have all resulted in massive displacement. Just in the past week, we have seen an exodus of nearly 100,000 people from Artsakh. In the Republic of Georgia, IDPs account for 308,000 people, and this is out of a total population of about 3.7 million, which makes displacement an important political and social issue in the country. Outside of ecological migrants, this population can broadly be separated into 2 major groups, or 2 waves of displacement. Those who are newly displaced from the 2008 Russo-Georgian conflict, and those IDPs that were displaced during armed conflict following the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. My talk today will focus on the IDPs that have been displaced for nearly 30 years. The diverse struggles of IDPs in Georgia has been well documented in the scholarly literature. This research has exposed issues related to poor labor market outcomes, loss of educational opportunities, poverty, disability, substance abuse, as well as psychological and physical health problems. In addition to this, the issue of durable housing makes up an important dimension of this scholarship. And much of it concerns the nearly 40% of Georgian IDPs who ended up in what are called collective centers compared to private housing. Hotels, schools, industrial complexes, hospitals, sporting facilities, buildings that were abandoned, and many of which were not suitable for living, became shelters for those who had been displaced in the wars in the 90s. critical attention has been given to the marginalization and social exclusion caused by the failure to integrate these collectively settled IDPs into Georgian mainstream society. And the severity of this IDP housing problem has been especially demonstrated in a number of popular media stories. For example, in 2010, a 46-year-old woman was hospitalized with severe burns after setting herself on fire in front of the Georgia Ministry for Displaced Persons, demanding to be rehoused. In 2017, IDPs in Zugdidi sewed their mouths shut and staged a hunger strike in protest. And most recently, a 52-year-old man living in the sanatorium Kartli in Tbilisi jumped to his death over unlivable housing. These are just a few incidences and do not reflect the stories of men and women who have died in fires, falling from broken balconies, or just from neglect. A feminist curiosity in the emotional impact of the precarious material and environmental conditions of IDP housing conditions prompted us to ask the following question. How do housing infrastructure conditions impact IDPs' identity, dignity, personhood, agency, and their sense of futurity? This research question was largely informed by what we call the emotional and affective turn in political ecology. This is an area of research seeking to better recognize the often undervalued political work of emotions and the gendered, intimate, and power-laden embodiments of environmental and social justice conflicts. Scholarship exploring emotional ecologies situates emotions within a web of relations, revealing the complex and multifaceted affective attachments people have to their environments, and in turn, their effects. Such a framework takes into consideration the multiple geographies and temporal dimensions of ecological feelings, their social and political dimensions, and the relationships that emerge from and contribute to. We theorize that being attentive to felt geographies of displacement, we could better measure how marginalization is operationalized through urban environmental factors and absences and disconnections in things like water, sanitation, heating systems, and even the conditions of disrepair themselves. In the literature, attention to the exclusion and marginalization suffered by specific individuals and groups due to planning, design, and provision of infrastructure and services has been termed infrastructural violence by authors such as Rogers and O'Neill. In our project, we are especially attentive to the intimate and gender dimensions of infrastructural violence, such as how housing quality impacts life trajectories, upends everyday routines and social and cultural practices, or shapes relationships. We view these types of impacts not just as infrastructural violence, but as a manifestation of a larger, slow, attritional violence that represents the extension of war's capacity to harm over an elongated time horizon. To empirically study the emotional and intimate effects of infrastructure, we undertook what we call a feminist visual ethnography. Our study combined participant observation, documentary photography, semi-structured walking interviews, and photovoice as our principal methods of data collection. Photovoice is a community-based photographic participatory research method, which involves research participants of limited power in the research process through photography, as a way for them to tell their stories and have more control over their stories. To situate my questions and methods, we focused on a small sample of the 10,000 internally displaced people, mostly ethnic Georgian, although some Swan and Megrelians, who ended up in the city of Tskaltubo after being displaced from the disputed territory of Abkhazia. During the Soviet era, Tskaltubo and its 22 sanatoria attracted thousands of Soviet citizens under the 1936 Constitution, which guaranteed basically homo civiticus, this idea of the Soviet worker, the right to rest and leisure. No longer operational after the collapse of the USSR, the decomposing remains of this once luxurious balneological spa town became a refuge for thousands of IDPs. Although IDPs originally believed this arrangement to be temporary, they ended up spending 30 years living in these buildings until most were resettled in the last year. Renewed interest in the investment and economic development of this spa industry in Tskaltubo in 2019, and the unique history of this location is really what drew us to this particular field site, especially in reflecting on the concerns that IDPs' needs might be compromised in favor of other state political and economic priorities as they were privatizing these state-owned buildings. Our research took place in two parts. In the summer and fall of 2021, we studied the emotional implications of decaying infrastructure through photovoice. Although we interviewed many IDPs and key stakeholders as part of this project, only 10 IDPs actually participated in the photovoice component. And during this, they visually captured their experience inhabiting these sanatoriya spaces. Now, as we were completing this research, the Internally Displaced Persons, Eco-Migrants, and Livelihood Agency of Georgia awarded hundreds of apartment contracts to these same IDPs so that they would be resettled into new homes. This occurred while we were collecting data, and it coincided alongside local elections. You can determine what that means yourself. Because the transition to new housing was really important to our participants when we were doing our initial interviews, we decided to apply for additional funding so that we could turn this into a longitudinal study. We returned the next year in 2022 to then examine how the lives of these IDPs might have been transformed by the receipt of their new apartments if they managed to be resettled. We developed a new interview questionnaire to learn about how their lives had changed and the kinds of new challenges that they were experiencing. We interviewed these same 10 photovoice participants, and then we enrolled new participants into our study to diversify our sample and get new perspectives. This presentation today is going to focus on that first set of data collection when we did the photovoice project. So the emotional and intimate effects of infrastructural violence were powerfully captured in photovoice participant photos. While some photos were difficult to categorize, many could be grouped into the following broad themes. The first is dehumanization, humiliation, or shame. The second is fear, worry, and anxiety. And then the third category is escapism, nostalgia, and longing. These terms are really based on participants' use of what we called emotive language in their narratives and their photo descriptions, which we extrapolated through careful attention to the language of feeling that these folks use. So sensation words, mood words, disposition words. And through their photos, IDPs were able to tell their story about how this decaying infrastructure had disrupted their life trajectories, affected their decision-making processes, shaped their sense of identity, their dignity, and their personhood. In addition, the results of the project also offered us a really rich environmental history of the political life of infrastructure of Tskaltubo, which has this really unique Soviet history. So first, many of the photos vividly represented photovoice participants' experience with feeling dehumanized, embarrassed, ashamed, humiliated. We kind of group these words together because we see them as interrelated. For example, some participants shared especially powerful stories about the dehumanizing effects of going from what they described as having everything in Abkhazia to then having nothing as IDPs. They talked about not having proper hygiene and how their embarrassment had prevented them from doing things like pursuing romantic relationships, friendships, especially with non-IDP partners, or it prevented them even from hosting guests, which If you're not familiar with Georgian society, hosting guests is incredibly important to their cultural identity. Everything centers around the dinner table and supra, which is a type of feasting that they do. So not being able to properly do this can be deeply embarrassing. So the first photo I want to bring attention to is this one that's on the screen, Valeria's photo, Great Shame, which shows a blue tiled bathroom. In the corner, you can see a metal tank, which she describes as a creative solution for holding and heating water, especially when running water itself had not always been guaranteed, especially in the 1990s. Valeria really reluctantly showed this photograph, which is why I always like to start with it. With great unease, she told the story of this picture to assert the dehumanizing impacts of infrastructural conditions and the importance of basic hygiene to dignity. Her photo related to a story about how a family member wanted to visit from Sochi. They had been living in Russia and they were coming to visit. However, she had felt so ashamed, not just of where she lived, but the fact that this relative might have to use this bathroom, that she lied to her relative and said that she wouldn't be home so that they wouldn't have to have the encounter in the first place. In fact, when she told this story, she didn't want to choose this photo at first. And we reminded her that the process that we were using for this photo voice project was confidential. And that if there was ever a time for her to tell this story and for no one to know who she was, it was now. And in reminding her this, she changed her mind about sharing the photo. It was the first one she scanned over when she was asked to pick a photo, and she stopped on it. And then she said, no, I'm too embarrassed to talk about this one. And we said, why? And then we reiterated our consent procedures and how we were protecting our identity. And she decided that she said something along the lines of, if I'm uncomfortable every day, then I guess it's okay if someone looking at this photo is uncomfortable for a moment. So this next photo is monos waiting to be saved. And this is another example of how IDPs were grappling with feeling dehumanized. This photo is taken from a shared bathroom inside one of the buildings, sanatorium metallurgy specifically. Despite the grand architecture of many of these sanatorium buildings, and metallurgy is particularly romantic in a lot of ways. It has this beautiful chandelier. They've filmed game shows inside the sanatorium. It gets a lot of attention. She said that in contrast to this, the reality of the conditions are so uninhabitable. She uses this photo to underscore the human desire for comfort, stating that, quote, no one should live in these conditions. Later, she adds, we, both humans and the buildings, are waiting to be saved. The second category that we observed in the photos was generally centered around conveying the danger of the conditions in the sanatoriums. So stories about missing railings, the impact of mold and rot on one's health, the threat posed by animals who, especially as people started to vacate the sanatoriums, began to overtake the buildings, rats, snakes, street dogs, cats, cows even. These photos were taken and used to represent feelings of fear, worry, and anxiety. For example, Ia's photo here, titled Fear of Tomorrow, shows an important support column for the building that is wearing away, described by her as a harbinger of impending catastrophic collapse. She told us that she was most afraid of this place and avoids it as much as possible, though often worries because children tend to play near this location. Interestingly, she said she had never noticed whether the pillar had always been in such bad conditions until she had moved away for a few years, lived in the city, and then returned and really took in how dangerous it was. And you can see actually in this photo, there's a car parked in the background. So this is her car. And she said she would intentionally park away from the building because in case it collapsed, it wouldn't harm her car. Tasso's photo here, called Raining Cement, provides an additional example of this association with fear and danger with infrastructure conditions. This photo especially highlighted the important gendered and intergenerational kind of information that we received from this project. Participants who were mothers, like Tasso, tended to show us pictures of places that they were afraid to allow their children to play because of missing railings or fear that the ceiling would collapse on top of them. And in fact, I was told stories of people who had suffered traumatic brain injuries due to falling cement. Finally, these descriptions of fear and humiliation often contrasted against photos representing what we as a team have come to describe a warm nostalgia of longing for Abkhazia and seemingly fantastical childhood memories, friendship, communal life, and a lot of optimism. Photos in this category present to us as a type of escapism and tend to represent places of mental diversion that helped IDPs come to cope with the trauma of their experience. This category seemed to provide critical insight into some of the intergenerational dynamics of memory and emotion in relation to sanatoria. For example, some of the younger participants who had left Abkhazia as infants or very young children seemed to narrate and discuss landscape photographs that demonstrated more favorable and often jovial childhood memories, such as places they played or snuck away as teenagers to drink beer or took dance lessons, much like this photo, Ia's most valuable memory. This is a picture of a place that she took dance lessons and she learned traditional Abkhazian dances in them. One thing I liked when Ia was describing this photo is that she talked about how, for her, she had never been to Abkhazia. So really the sanatoriums were the only home that they had ever known in their lifetime, even though they were often told that their home was Abkhazia. This contrasted against those who fled in their late teenage years or older, so people who arrived in displacement as adults. Some of those who could remember the rapid shift to squalid living conditions sometimes avoided intimate spaces of their homes, such as bathrooms, in fear that they might confirm society's derogatory public perceptions of refugees as filthy, malodorous, and lazy. So this is where we tended to see these kind of more nostalgic, escapist type photos. They preferred to show us things that represented, the places of mental escape. So Lana's picture here, Path to Hope, is a place where she often would go sit in the park. So in Tskaltubo, there's a park in the center. And she said she would go here and sit on the bench and she would fantasize about places she used to sit at home. Particularly, there was a bench overlooking the Black Sea that she used to like to sit to. And she goes here to kind of reminisce about that place in her home. In addition to these major themes, the photos also told this history of decay and factors contributing to the building disrepair. The most common attribution for the dilapidation of the building seemed to relate to state failures and what some described as a kind of systematized apathy. Most collective centers had neither ever been renovated, or if they were, it was poorly done or only partially renovated. So for instance, they might fix a roof or they might install like one line of PVC pipe, but never like a systematic repair. As such, participants generally described being trapped in cycles of what there's a Georgian anthropologist, Tanta Kalvashi, she calls this cycles of brokenness and repair, where people are always kind of jerry-rigging things and then they re-break, and that those repairs are connected to larger systems that are malfunctioning or not functioning properly. Despite these systemic issues, my research team and I also observed the conditions between buildings and how they varied. Why were some of the newer brutalist structures, so for instance, Hotel Aia, in such poor condition compared to some of the older neoclassical structures, such as Sanatorium Tskaltubo? And for reference, Hotel Aia, I think, was built in 1985, so in the late Soviet moment, and Sanatorium Tskaltubo was built in 1930, when Stalin was still alive. So we asked things like, was this the result of different construction materials due to these different time periods? Did it have something to do with the way the buildings were designed? Did it have to do with occupancy rate? Or was it about carrying capacity, since these buildings were holding a permanent population when they were only intended to just be temporary housing for people who are coming to the spot? When we asked about what factors had influenced the deterioration of the buildings, we were surprised to receive our research participants' admissions of their own roles in hastening the processes of decay. A few of our participants described the buildings as, quote, nice at first, but atrophy, corruption, and looting contributed to the decline of these conditions, particularly in the 1990s. This seemed to occur as a general result of post-socialist societal instability that was happening across the country. As one participant explained, quote, life became bad for everyone, not just IDPs. Deterioration was accelerated by what I like to call the creative destruction of resources, such as the looting of aluminum, furniture, and the burning of parquet, which they bartered, sold off, or burned for heating purposes. However, this didn't totally explain why some spaces remained well maintained while others were in absolute ruins. For example, these were great pictures. The two I have here were taken by different participants in the same building who lived on different floors, but who didn't know each other. And we thought it was magnificent that they took like almost the same view of their floors, right, from their perspective. So one was taken by Alexander and the other of Georgi, and these are inside Hotel in Touristy. And this really shows how conditions starkly contrasted even in the same building itself. And when we probed, some participants explained that this actually reflected an ethic of care by the residents. Most admitted that they did not invest in caring in the buildings because they had perceived their displacement to be temporary. When they were breaking the glass in the windows to scrap the aluminum, they had not imagined that they would be living there 5, 10, 30 years down the road. Moreover, some of our older respondents in our study never fully accepted that the sanatorium was their home. For example, our participant Sokumchanka explained how it was never hers, it was not mine. Without that sense of ownership, some IDPs may have lacked the motivation to maintain and care for their spaces. So what we tend to see in some of the buildings is this kind of tragedy of commons effect that's observable, particularly when you compare internal spaces of someone's apartment versus the communal spaces in the building. So a lot of times you'll see the internal spaces of an apartment being neat and tidy, dry, whereas the communal spaces will be dank, cluttered with piles of garbage and all sorts of ephemera. For us, this really illustrated how our participants' emotional experiences had come to impact infrastructural change itself. So if you're wondering about the title of this presentation, this is where that emotional ecology comes in, is that we felt that these feelings that people had from their experience of inhabiting the space then in turn contributed to environmental change itself, how the spaces had transformed over time. However, our findings about this emotional ecology of decay and displacement only really became salient once we conducted our follow-up fieldwork a year later after IDPs had moved, and we could see how our participants were comparing their new housing to their prior experience living in the sanatoria. We learned that responses to the transition to new housing were complex, ambivalent, and even quite conflictual. Joy and gratitude, disappointment and discontent, new desires for a future life, and the old limiting reality all coalesced together in their responses. While the prompt receipt of new apartments was generally welcome, especially after such a long and arduous wait, many remained concerned about spatial justice and whether the government had really delivered on its 2014 promise to, quote, create safe and dignified living conditions for IDPs before their return to their places of permanent residence. IDPs raised three major sets of concerns related to the infrastructural conditions of these new apartments that they received. I'm just going to briefly talk about these so you have a sense of the comparison, but I'm not going to elaborate too deeply into this since it's not centered on the photo voice component. These concerns, we argue, highlight critical gaps in the planning and implementation of housing infrastructure. We argue that these gaps represent a type of carelessness, referring to the highly uneven and unequal ways that these physical components, interrelated systems, and type of governance shape social life as a result of being designed and implemented with insufficient attention, negligence, apathy, or indifference. So our three kind of findings. First was that IDPs raised concerns related to the impact and fairness of the monitoring system that's used to determine when IDPs receive an apartment and what size apartment that their family gets. Specifically, participants were concerned with how definitions of the family itself and who the head of the family had ultimately just determined the size of their apartments that they received. So the government provides a formula for calculating this, but in practice, we see that this isn't always followed and that our participants themselves didn't fully understand how in completing the bureaucratic process of filling out paperwork and determining who their family unit was, that would ultimately determine what apartment that they received. And so many, I think, were grappling with, well, why did we only get a one-bedroom apartment when our family size is X or our family composition is this? Moreover, they also raised concerns that such small apartments tended to fail to account for the changing in family dynamics over time. So over 30 years, the IDP population in Georgia has grown, not necessarily due to the 2008 war, but because IDPs had babies, and those babies became IDPs. So now there are many more people who need housed than the original displaced population. So there's a lot of concerns about what this means for family over the long term, especially when families are growing and changing. The second concern that was raised was related to the quality of construction and design, as well as the affordability of necessities to furnish and equip those units. So the photos that you're seeing now are primarily photos that I took, and these show the new apartments, just to give you a sense of what they look like. So for example, in one building, the roof is already leaking. The basements have already flooded. The walls are described to us as soft. We have concerns about the fact that there's only a single stairwell and that there may not be proper exits in the case of a fire. Lots of things concerning safety and quality of materials. In addition, these apartments did not come equipped with heating systems, gas, hot water heaters, kitchen cabinets, or any appliances. So for a population that's often struggling to just pay their electricity bill, now they have this new apartment, but they have the burden now of furnishing it, of installing vital infrastructure, which they can't afford. Finally, concerns stress the impact of the new apartments on what we called social relational issues related to hospitality, communal life, and privacy. The new buildings lack communal spaces for people to properly host guests, for children to play, for residents to gather, and spaces to undertake livelihood and agricultural practices, which have always been vital to their everyday lives. Many of these things they were able to do because the sanatoriums are expansive building complexes with lots of land around them. So they were able to have gardens. Some people planted whole orchards that are full grown in the time of their displacement. They have cows and chickens. They grow grapes. So many people worried when they were moving, what will happen to my grapes? What will I do? I've lost these things again that I lost before in Abkhazia. Moreover, we also received concerns related to how so few bedrooms, especially in mixed gender and mixed generational household, were denying IDPs the reasonable right to privacy. So there was one story of a woman who was in a one room apartment, like essentially what we would call a studio, and it was her and her elderly mother. And she talked about how her mother went to bed early, and she went to work early, and just these two things never lined up, but they were in one single room, and that this was just disruptive. Let alone, she didn't even talk about, but it was implied, like, what if I met a guy and want to bring him home, and here's my mother right here. There's no place for us to go. So there are a lot of concerns about just the size of these apartments and what it means for social relations in general. Despite these findings, I do want to underscore that compared to what is described as a dehumanizing situation in the collective centers, our research participants showed how improved, albeit very imperfect, infrastructural conditions had helped to restore their sense of dignity, agency, and the chance to imagine and create alternative futures. Moreover, many discussed the significance of private property ownership for reducing the feeling of precarity, of affording a greater sense of stability and security, which are both emotionally transformative experiences for them. This video in the background will show you what an empty unit looks like. There's perhaps no greater illustration of the transformative potential of improved infrastructure conditions than the story of our participant, Nata. And in the podcast interview today, I shared a piece of this story. Nata herself is actually not an IDP, but a woman who married into an IDP household. She married older, so the birth of her children is really regarded as her crowning life achievement. This is evidenced in her responses and all of her photos, which center around the care of her children. Nata presented as one of the most poor, marginalized, and vulnerable participants in our study. We observed the difficulty of her in comprehending and answering our questions. We could tell that there were maybe issues with literacy, for instance, and the uncomfortable way in which she would shield her mouth with her hand as she spoke to disguise her mouth of missing teeth, a marker of structural violence that she had experienced her entire life. We initially had concern about her agency since her husband had initially volunteered her to participate in our project. She met us with a lot of mistrust and suspicion, fearful that of the monitors and that doing anything like talking to us might jeopardize the receipt of her new apartment. While she was deeply kind of downtrodden and ashamed of her living conditions, which were in the Imereti sanatorium, she still agreed to be a participant of our research. When we met Nata a year later, after the lottery, which is the process in which they're granted these apartment contracts, she greeted us jovially at the top of the stairs that led into her new 3-room apartment on the 5th floor. She was beaming like the bright yellow walls of the new apartment. This is a powerful reversal of the woman we had met before. She proudly showed us the 2 large sofas and 3 armchairs, a TV, heating system, a large cabinet along the back wall, which she had acquired with the help of family. Compared to before, she likes everything and is very happy. Those are her words. When asked what 3 words she would use to describe the apartment, she reiterated that she was happy, that it was a wish for her kids, and that her kids have a stable roof over their heads. We talked a bit about the lottery process, how her daughter had picked the apartment location, and how she was pleased to be on a lower floor, always reminding us of the importance of the safety of her kids. When we asked how her life will be different now, she tells us that she's less ashamed to have guests. And although it's something seemingly mundane, she then mentions to us the possibility of getting a job. And this alone was a really powerful representation of how this new space had enabled her to imagine a totally different type of future for herself and her kids. Well, this story reminds and signals to us how improved living conditions might begin to restore one's sense of humanity, dignity, agency, and personhood. It's important to remember that at its current pace, it is estimated that it will take another 20 years for the Georgian government to house all the remaining IDPs. That's 50 years after displacement for some people. Therefore, we use this research to motivate others to consider how to make housing, urban environments, and post-socialist cities in particular more spatially just and caring. When we asked our research subjects about whether the government had ever engaged with them about the design or the construction of the new housing, every single respondent said, no. Ara. This really showed us the importance of greater inclusion of IDPs in decision-making processes. In moving forward, we urge our audience to use the case of Tskaltubo to consider practices for improved participatory governance, community organizing, and collaboration on the local level to deploy urban planning tools that can simultaneously respond to urban development challenges, like what's happening in Tskaltubo, and the intimate needs of displaced people. Thank you.
Any questions?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Otruba. I have a question. I was paying attention to what you said about how new spaces enable IDP to imagine different future for themselves, but also how infrastructural violence can cause emotional distress and affect the well-being of the IDPs. So my question is, do you have, or would you mind sharing any evaluation methods or metrics for assessing the impact of infrastructural violence on IDPs' well-being?
Yeah, so if I'm understanding correctly, so how do we measure infrastructural violence? Yeah, this is, well, I think what I've learned from this project, right? So we looked at it through this lens of emotion. So we're really interested in how people were describing what they had gone through. So I do think that continues to be a useful tool, like the discourses that folks are using to describe how living under a particular set of conditions makes them feel, right? So that's the psychological kind of dimension. But I think in the greater literature, there are specific elements that you can look at that might indicate the presence of infrastructural violence. So I think there's a lot of attention to bathrooms and just in general hygiene conditions. So do residents have access to a bathroom? Is that bathroom shared? Does that bathroom have a functioning toilet? Do they have privacy in that bathroom? Are they exposing themselves to, because we also know that, women, for instance, might be at risk for certain types of gender-based violence in places that are communal or shared, as well as in their own intimate homes, right? So we can look at bathrooms. We can look at access to water, potable water. So this is, in Tskaltubo, it's actually an incredible conundrum. This is a city who has this unique geology on top of these radon carbonate springs that was the source of developing the spa industry. So people were coming from all over the Soviet Union to receive medical treatments because they believed these spas had healing properties. Yet this water is radon carbonate water, which exposure to this too long could have a carcinogenic effect. So one of the things that our participants talked about in our early interviews, we asked them if they knew about kind of this water. And my research assistant, Nino, who's listening here, she would tell you that they actually described the water as dangerous water to us. And we were shocked. We were like, oh, maybe they just didn't know that like exposure to this water could be harmful. And they had a whole term for it. And so they would talk about how, if possible, they would go out of Tskaltubo to get water and bring it back to the sanatoriums to use, because they couldn't use the bathhouses because exposure to it could present a health risk. Nonetheless, people still ended up using that water. So access to water, I think, is something that we can look at, we can measure to indicate infrastructural violence. I think how people describe their use of space is another, I think that's a little bit more difficult to measure, but for us as feminist scholars, we're really interested in intimacy and the gender dimensions of this. And a lot of people's concerns centered on like the size of the apartment and what that meant for how they use that, how they can use space, and whether they can pursue things like romantic relationships. So I know I just told a couple of folks this story earlier today. We met a man who was still living in the sanatorium this last summer, and he was about middle-aged, had been previously married, had some grown-up daughters, and was now divorced. And he brought us into a room and he showed us how there was no toilet. You had to like go across the hall, and there was literally a hole in the wall to outside, and there was just like water coming in and a toilet sitting there. And he was like, oh, if I use the bathroom, I have to go here. And in his house, he had taken the former balcony and transformed it into a kitchen and had a shower in the kitchen next to his little mini fridge. And he says to us point blank, he says, how can you bring ladies back to a place like this, right? To illustrate that, like, this was not a place he could pursue a romantic relationship, especially with someone who was not an IDP. Like, what do I have to offer? And we had heard other stories where folks had shared similar stories. I fell in love with this girl. I wanted to marry her. I never pursued the relationship because she was not an IDP. So I think we can think about how, like, we can use the collection of those types of social and relational impacts as a way of measuring whether there's infrastructural violence. Those are some examples. Does that respond to your question?
A little bit, but still not really clear to me. Because I felt like when you talk about infrastructural violence, it is very contextual. And in this case, we are talking about people who had a certain standing or standards of life. They used to have this kind of sanitary facility maybe before they were displaced. And then they find themselves in a context where they don't have those things anymore. So therefore, they have an element of comparison. Like, this is different than what I am used to. But in a different context, if I use, for instance, a population like the Pygmies, for instance.
Yeah.
They've never had those things.
I do think, I think you make a really important point. I do think we could decide as scholars or practitioners whether there's a set of criteria. But ultimately, your comment points to how context, right, decides what people accept, right? So yeah, it's an interesting point. In Georgia, one distinction that we like to make is that these infrastructural challenges are not unique to IDPs. This is like largely a collective experience among many people where we've just seen the disinvestment in infrastructure, particularly after the Soviet collapse. So and this is something that often when Georgians are in the audience, they'll, like if they lived through the 90s, they'll say, well, we all were living like this. What makes IDPs special, right? But that doesn't mean it's not violence, right? So I think it's a really interesting point. Like, and this is where participatory methods are important to ask people, what is this violence, right? Like, would you consider this? For our participants, it's very clear that these are the sources of different types of suffering. So I feel comfortable with these things being used in my study as a measure of that.
Thank you very much.
So just in sort of paraphrasing some of your participants, would they refer to themselves as an IDP, or is there a different word or way to referring to themselves? Because you said, you know, I wanted to have a relationship with someone, but she wasn't an IDP. So did he refer to himself as an IDP, or how did they refer to themselves?
Yeah, Nino, did you hear this question? I don't know if you would want to respond to this. We've definitely talked about this word. So in Georgia, IDP, for my opinion, and Nino, can we unmic her? Is that possible? Yeah, okay. She can correct me if I'm wrong. So this word, internally displaced person, is definitely this imported thing from like Western humanitarian like community. So they tend to refer to themselves as refugees, and there's definitely a stigma to that word. I'm trying to think about our interviews, and because we're using this, like we're talking about them as displaced, I think they accept that term, but I'm trying to think I think they self-identify now because bureaucratically there's the law on IDPs in Georgia. So now this is a legal category that has been created that entitles you to particular benefits and things like housing. So they now identify to this, but I do think it's an invention that kind of has been imposed from the top down. I think she's typing.
Ariel, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a small comment to previous question as well. To a person asking question about measurements, how do you approach this measurement? And do you remember we also were talking about more quantitative piece, how to measure this violence? And one of the things that came up to our mind was a space to human ratio. Again, this is also not universal, but all those hotels where IDPs were resettled, they had number of people that were supposed to live there, right? Like according to hotel standards. And then at some specific point of time, you could also look at how many more people lived. Yes, of course, it's not necessarily violence, but it's at least to describe discomforts. Instead of living 2 people in a room, there were like families, like 8 or 9 people who didn't even have a space to lie down on beds, and they would rotate. Someone would sleep on the bed today, and even children, and then they would rotate. Another time they would sleep on the floor because there was not enough space to put enough beds in a space, right? So that's another way also to look at it. But even this measurement doesn't fully I think embrace the notion of this violence or discomfort. So, but that could have been one of the ways to look at quantitatively, I would say. And yes, Ariel, you're absolutely right about the second question. So at first, the IDPs were referred as refugees, but that word got more negative connotation. And then IDPs was a attempt, I think, not only attempt, but legally too, because refugee means that someone leaves their own country and moves to a different country. And Abkhazia wasn't a different country, it was part of Georgia. So that's why they came with the term internally displaced people, right? Not refugees. And the term IDP was a little bit sort of like a remedy, try to soften all the negative impacts or stereotyping these people had before. But they would openly identify themselves as IDPs because, again, it's not only legal terminology, but they also pride, right? They pride themselves in that, they had different lives and they survived and they came and they are trying to adjust. So, yeah.
I wondered too, if we might think about this from a politically strategic point of view, the mobilization by the government to adopt IDP to also reinforce their claims over territory, right? So if colloquially people are saying refugee, then that's reinforcing the separation of Abkhazia from Georgia. But if we use IDP, then we're reasserting that sovereignty claim over that space too. So I'm sure some folk out there in the government were fully conscious of that decision.
I wonder if we could wrap up, if you could explain, I know you told the story earlier, the keys, and we'll finish with that.
Yeah, so this, I didn't get a chance to share this story. So this was the first time we ever saw the new apartments. Nino and I were starting to wrap up the photovoice project, and our participant, Sokun Shanka, that's her, it's a funny pseudonym. It means what is it, girl from Sukhumi?
Sukhumi. Right.
Yeah, which means woman from Sukhumi, which is the capital of Abkhazia. So unlike the other folks who chose kind of mundane names, there was some humor in the choice. She had received her apartment before almost any of our other participants. And so she was like, oh, you need to come see it. You have to come see all the problems with this place. So she invited us there, and she showed us all the cheap materials and everything. And then she pulled out her keys and held them out in her hands. And she basically said that the keys were like a metaphor for how the government cared for them. So if you look at the photo, there's only one functioning key. The other two are broken. And she thought this was a perfect representation of how IDPs have been treated by the government.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your reflection.